we've got a panel discussion here. We want to make it as interactive as possible. One of the challenges as I sit up here is that I've got two very bright lights staring me right in the face, so I can't see everyone. So if you do have questions, and as we're pointing out, or as we're maybe asking you all questions, if you can either raise your hand real loud, or if you've got something to say, we'd love to hear it from you. But right now, I wanted to introduce our panelists for today. To my left here, we've got Dave Irvin. Dave has degrees in architecture and planning from Nebraska and Oxford. Dave headed the facilities at 5 different universities. He currently serves as the Associate Vice President of Facilities for Florida State University, where he leads a team of over 800, maintaining 1,000 acres, 20 plus million square feet, and 60 million M&O budget, and 1 billion in capital and renewal construction. Dave also serves as the national chair of APA. So if you're unfamiliar with what Dave looks like, you've been living under a rock. Out there at a lot of podcasts, so we're excited to have him. Next to him, we've got Alex Kohnen. He's the interim VP for Facilities Management at Arizona State. After graduating from the Naval Academy with an aerospace engineering degree, Alex spent the next 20 years in the Navy before joining Arizona State. It's his first time in higher education, but he's been here for several years at Arizona State. He holds the position of Assistant Vice President of Facilities Management and Operations, overseeing workforce of over 400. He's currently working on a PhD in building controls and energy response, and as part of that work is working on 2 separate grants on planning and energy efficiency for the Department of Navy and the country of Mongolia.
Go Army,
And then to his left, we've got Paige Smith. She's the Vice Chancellor for Administrative Services at University of Wisconsin-Platteville. Paige is the Vice Chancellor, and in this role, she is responsible for overseeing the Offices of Human Resources, Ethics and Compliance, Safety, Risk Management, and University Police, Facilities Management, Campus Planning and Projects, Financial Services, Program Management, Center of Excellence, and all the auxiliary services. Prior to UW, Paige served as the Chief Institutional Policy and Compliance for the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, as well as in-house legal counsel for the University of Wisconsin System and Southern Illinois University. She received a Bachelor in Science degree and Law degree from Southern Illinois University. So these are your panelists. Please welcome them. Before we get started, I just want to take a little bit of a straw poll, and if you can raise your hand if you're from a public institution. All right, private institution, I assume. All right, any community colleges represented? Okay, and if you're in K-12, get out. You're down the block. Just kidding. How about big school? Raise your hand if you're in a big school over, let's say, 4 million square feet. All right, medium, 1 to 4. Okay, small school. Okay. All right, just give us a little bit of understanding of who our audience is. So I wanted to kind of start off with just kind of a little bit of a recap of what's been on my mind for the last 18 months, as I've seen and talked to many of you, some of you that are in the seats here, is that, we all know COVID's been dominating our lives the last 18 months. And when we had the spike in the Delta variant, one of the challenges that I saw, one of the things that I was impressed with was, as facility directors and chief facility officers and VPs and vice chancellors, you didn't miss a beat, right? It was business as usual, and we were ready to take on the next step. So the title of this was pretty apropos. We're here, where do we go next? And I think falls right in line with, I think, everybody's feelings of what's getting past COVID. So I'll just kind of start on the panel, with the panel discussion, ask the question is, how has your role changed, kind of pre-pandemic and then post-pandemic, as a chief facility officer and within your university, and how you're viewed? So with that, Alex, you want to take the first one?
Okay, thank you. And let me start out with being Army. And then from there, well, I think the first thing that happened is in the beginning of COVID, the nice part was the job didn't, you're right, change at all. We were still maintaining facilities with the exception there's no one there. So we had a lot of deferred maintenance that we were able to start prioritizing, a lot of work orders we started doing. And then quickly, what are we going to do? And the positive side is we got a seat at the table now. We had a lot of deans and the provosts that were interested in facilities suddenly in a way that was much more dynamic than simply this doesn't work and I'm upset about it. It was how are we going to fit these kids in these classrooms and socially distance? How are we going to sanitize in a way that makes people feel comfortable? I don't know how many of your provosts cared about HVAC systems, but I know mine had detailed knowledge of HVAC systems and Irv 13s by the end of the pandemic. So that was a huge challenge because we had to deal with not just the physical plant, but the social anxiety that came with how the physical plant interacted. Every news article created generated a response, and we had to become much more media relations oriented as facility people than we ever have in the past. And I think that was an important and significant detail that those who focused on that issue did well, and those who did not focus on that issue quickly found themselves overwhelmed because we quickly said, hey, listen, we need the virologist to come in here and talk to us, and we would ask FAQs every week and say, okay, does it make sense to put filtration units in every classroom? And they quickly said, no, that's just silly, and here's why. So we had a canned answer for that. Do we need unidirectional stairwells? No, it's 15 minutes, and if you're passing some of the stairs, you're not getting a virus because of it. So a lot of things that other institutions, not just universities, did, we were able to avoid because, again, we had our FAQs lined up and we were ready to deal with it.
So I think I'd say that it accelerated the trend we were seeing before. Way back, university facilities were really just seen as a cost center. And we had moved to being a service center, but still sort of a support function. What we saw during COVID, and I hope that we continue after COVID, is we moved from being a service center to being a pillar of support for the university. There was an understanding that we were not just there to perform services, but we were really a critical, mission-critical part of what the university did. I would tag team on what Alex said a little bit. Both of the institutions, I was at Tennessee before Florida State, we certainly had the same kind of FAQs, but we also discovered, if we didn't already know as facility directors, that the political consequences of what we did in the environment of where we operate has a huge impact on how we approach things. And we, in more ways than we've ever had before, COVID put a fine point on that. We do have a seat at the table, but we now understand it's a very complex table. It's not just giving, this is what you need from the facility standpoint, but understanding what the political ramifications of what we do are, and what the political questions that administration is trying to answer are, and how we fit into those. So, yes, we're at the table. We find out now that it's much more complex and much harder to be at that table than many of us envision.
And I agree, very similar to what others experienced dealing with, again, the changes in the classroom and the flipping the classrooms, and then also just ensuring that we were, as a leadership team, hearing from the essential individuals on campus in order to make right decisions. Because a lot of the work that's done in facilities, is not specifically known at times by the leadership of the institutions. And suddenly we're bringing them on and they're providing input and giving us a better understanding of what it takes to, in fact, operate a building, be sure that we were providing a clean space. And one of the additional issues we saw was that the facilities workers were coming to campus, but some were apprehensive. And so we really had to do a really good job of working with HR and ensuring them that their safety was as important as everyone else's. And even though most were now remote, these individuals were coming to work every day, at the front lines, ensuring that the campus was safe. And so we tried really hard to keep those communications open and ensure that everyone understood the value of the work.
So you all have a seat at the table now, and now you have to perform. What do we do? So, Dave, from a planning perspective, where was the university pre-pandemic, and coming out of the pandemic, where have they changed focus from a master planning perspective?
We have, obviously a leading question because we've talked before. At Florida State, we had started our master plan before COVID. It was paused at the beginning of COVID, and our master plan before was kind of the typical master plan. If you were a director or dean and you wanted a building, it was in the master plan. Didn't mean you'd get it real right away, but you could point to it. And so our master plan was sort of a land use diagram populated by these gorgeous buildings and wonderful renderings. I think we contemplating to add another 20 million square feet. After and during COVID, what we discovered, or maybe rediscovered, was that there's a financial component to all that, certainly something Paige can understand. And that we really didn't have a viable master plan if that wasn't part of the equation. And COVID certainly showed that we could use space in a different way. We really ought to use space in a different way. But it also exacerbated the budget issues that we've been dealing with probably our whole careers, and that I think are going to continue to be a really pinch point. So we changed the master plan from one that was primarily new space to, we flipped it on its head. So now the master plan only shows $1 million or so of new space. Most of that is in athletics. We are in the southeast, so we've got to keep doing athletics. But now we're looking much more at renovation and reuse of space, and how do we maybe address some of those different maintenance issues, but in a way that meets the mission. And the other thing that we did was we added some components to new space. So it used to be if you wanted new space, you could find a donor, you probably got it. Now, however, at Florida State, you still have to have those donors probably, maybe some state support. But you also have to do two things. You have to have an endowment for the operating and maintenance of that building that will pay for that going forward. And you have to have an endowment that will be used for deferred maintenance of that building going forward. And those are two huge changes. Doesn't get to the backlog, but it does ensure that we aren't continuing to add to that. And that's a dramatic change from how we approached master planning before COVID.
Yeah, I've only seen that philosophy in the private institutions and some of the wealthy K-12 boarding schools having that endowment philosophy. You mentioned space, and I'll ask Alex. I think every space is on everybody's mind. Whether are we going to go hybrid, are we staying 100% in person? What does that look like? And then are there space on campuses or on our campus that we can release the hidden value, aka demolish, and or are there opportunities for us to reuse that differently? What's been your experience?
Yeah, I think we're still figuring this out. I think there's a huge generational issue that's going on right now, and we're trying to navigate it. ASU has about 78,000 students on campus currently right now, about 27 million square feet, and we lease another 3 million square feet. And the question we keep asking the administration is, when are we going to start discussing space management? When are we going to get out of this 3 million square feet that we potentially don't need with hybrid work and remote work? And we've been incredibly resistant to that because and my personal belief is that there's this belief in the generation that is currently existing in the executive committee that in person is a much more contextualized, much more rich environment for interactions. And in the student population, I think it's completely different. They find the ability to transmit data in the cyber realm much quicker than we can do that currently. They laugh at us in our analog discussions because we're transmitting kilobits and they're transmitting gigabits at that way. And so they're looking for a hybrid where they can choose from a class standpoint, and we're still discussing whether we can do it at the office level. So we have what we call ASU Sync right now, where students have an option to either come to class or view it remotely on a regular basis. And when you go to those classes, you'll see that there's about 20-30% that take up the offer of coming in person and prefer that. But the majority are still moving remotely. And yet in the office space, we're still struggling having a really defined purpose. We just released our hybrid work plan. And no matter what I said, we did 60% in person, which makes it nearly impossible to desk share right now. And so we're having that discussion of, was that the best choice for us as a university? Well, we want to only dip our toe in right now. We don't really want to give up that space. So by keeping it 60%, everybody still has that dedicated desk. And so I think we're going to have a lot of challenges moving forward if we don't, because we are already seeing the consequences of not having a full remote strategy. We're losing people to municipalities that are paying basically what we're paying, but they have a full remote. We just lost a purchasing agent to University of Colorado. So if you want to live in Colorado, just live in Colorado. I'm living right at my house right now. I'm full remote. They offered me the job full remote on day one, and that's what I want. And so I really worry that higher ed in its brick and mortar institution is missing an opportunity here.
Maybe any insights from Platteville?
Well, we're talking about space, we do obviously look closely at our space utilization, but we are a public regional institution that's part of a 13 four-year institution system. And we also have a very actively engaged state administration in regard to our building plans, our academic planning. And we're seeing declining enrollments at UW-Platteville, really across the state, but specifically at our rural regional institution. And it was happening pre-COVID. So COVID just highlighted the fact that we thought we would see additional enrollment declines this last year. We haven't seen any flip as far as students' engagement on online learning more. In fact, our online learning programs have not enhanced either. But we are now trying to deal with, again, the spacing and the deferred maintenance with our buildings. Our buildings are built in the 1950s and 60s. And we have systems and equipment that all are no longer repairable, they need replaced. And because we are tied to the state funding requirement, we really rely very heavily on the State Building Commission and the system in order to help us make those plans for improvements, which is really challenging. It takes us 6 years after we've received approval for a project in order to get it to completion. And that's assuming that there's not a delay or some other issue that causes the priorities of system to change to another institution's needs. So that's what's happening as far as our planning. Do you want me to talk about workforce?
We'll hold that for a minute or two. Continue on the space. Show of hands, who has, if you know, whether or not your scheduling for your academic classrooms is centralized? 100% centralized. That's what I thought. So there's still departmentally controlled space out there that we know is not utilized as effectively as that is centralized. Historically, the business officer has looked at space as a minefield. Right? It's almost career suicide to go against the academic provost. Do you see that changing at all, given where we've come from and where we're going through?
I think it'll still be led by the provost, as it probably should be, but I think that increasingly the CFO, our vice president, has a bigger role to play in that just because of the economics and needing to really look at where we're going forward. And touching on that and tag teaming on Alex a little bit, I think it's more than just whether we can go remote. We've proved we can do that. It's trying to determine what's the nature of place-based learning. And that undoubtedly varies by institution. But we all know, for instance, that facilities has a big role in recruitment. So folks go online and they look at pictures of our institution and so on, or maybe they do a campus tour. They're starting to do that again. What we haven't really focused on is the role we have in student retainment. And that really gets to not just whether it's remote or not, but what's the nature of place-based learning? What role do we have as facilities folks? What role do our CFOs have in that aspect? It's not just a budget decision. It's very much part of the mission of what it means to be our particular institution, what's our niche. So when we talk about space and utilization, I think that dynamic of it is one that we as facilities officers are uniquely positioned to talk about. Utilization, we can certainly guide and make suggestions, but the academic side is probably going to dictate a lot of that. But we can make good suggestions on how we use space and how we do that to retain students and how that becomes part of the brand of our institution.
But don't you think that as we've started to have these collaborative discussions about how to occupy, that's going to bleed over into the pedagogy and how we're going to start designing spaces to fit that? And I don't think we've actually had that kind of philosophy in the past. It's you tell me what you want, I put it into a scope and I build a building. Now you're telling me what you want. Let me tell you all the other options that are available. And I think we're having a discussion about, do we do open floor plate now for our next building where we let the TI dictate how we partition the space, so we're invested for 5 years, not 50 years in that floor plate, and we can move on when you guys decide there's something else coming in that regard. And the enthusiasm we're getting when that discussion happens is exciting. The provost has actually hired a VP liaison to talk to the business and finance side of the house, so we can actually have these commitments with each other from here on. And I think that's been a huge positive outcome.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think we have that unique perspective and that unique expertise through things like this. we've never been asked that before.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the big changes.
And sort of on a side note, one of our challenges on our campus is that we did get approval for a brand new engineering building a few years ago. And the one thing that we don't do well is we don't plan for the maintenance of those buildings. So we received the budget to build it, but as soon as it's built, the state goes away, takes the funding with them, and we're now relying on our campus revenues in order to maintain this building and ensure that we have the proper equipment and expertise on our campus in order to do it well. This new building is a living learning lab. It's something that is very much high tech. It's going to serve our students extremely well, but we are limited on the capacity of the expertise and funding and resources in order to maintain this building. So we have about a year and a half to figure it out, but we recognize we're in a significant budget challenge. And so we have to really start putting more attention on planning for maintenance of buildings, both new and remodeled. Otherwise, we're actually demolishing buildings. That's my request this year to the state is allow us to in fact demolish 5 or 6 buildings because they're also sitting there requiring deferred maintenance and taking up resources of our facilities staff. And they're not safe buildings. As I mentioned earlier, they're so dilapidated and I'm concerned about our quality. I'm concerned about staff and students being in those buildings. But we are truly reliant on ourselves in order to try to address our problems.
Higher ed in general has always had a difficult time knocking down buildings. They hold on to them forever and ever and ever. I know pre-pandemic that was definitely the mantra for many institutions that I speak with. Has that significantly changed? Do you feel like you're truly going to get some greater buy-in to say, okay, we need to look more fiscally sustainable at our university and maybe getting rid of that building it's time?
Well, I can speak just quickly on the fact that we have 13 institutions and it is the majority of our institutions in their project planning involves demolition because of enrollment declines and because of the building structure and the age of the building. So it is something that we're pushing our state building commission to take advantage of and allow us to continue on this path for planning because it's going to be it's an absolute need and it has to be done sooner than later.
I think the one thing, and I'll go back to the pandemic, that we've been growing at over 5% a year for over a decade now. So trying to knock something down is nearly impossible because we need the space out there. We've never had the opportunity to create the breathing space we need to start doing some of these major renovations. They're minor renovations that we've had. So I think the opportunity to push some classes to remote, to give us some elbow room that we otherwise wouldn't have had, is going to be a positive. On the other side of the fence, when you issue system revenue bonds and your asset that you're issuing that bond against is your capital plant, your physical plant, eliminating portions of the physical plant can also be challenging in and of itself from a purely financial perspective.
As part of that planning process, we talked about deferred maintenance. It's been a very large issue in higher education. We've all talked about it for years. And the last time that HEFF was here was actually in Florida 2 years ago. And we our company, co-presented with Don Caulfield out of Carnegie Mellon. And he made the comment that has resonated with me, and I wanted to ask if it's resonating at the universities today, is that for 10 plus years he was hitting the administration in the forehead with a ball-peen hammer about here's our problem, here's the deferred maintenance. And he said he only got traction when he turned around and said, I have a solution for this. And they started listening. And he's continuing down that path. Are we finding that administration's tired of this is the problem, show me solutions? And I guess follow up,
Yeah.
What would that look? What does that look like for your institutions?
The challenge is I don't know if we know the whole solution. I think I would agree with him though that we're having better luck by framing the question in a different way. So rather than talking about deferred maintenance, because you're right, we've been talking about that for decades. We're talking more about capital renewal, strategic investment. Maybe just in words, but it gets back to what we were saying before, that we've moved from being a service center to a key pillar of mission support for our university. We're finding if we can tie deferred maintenance to what the mission and goal of the university is, and what that investment in that building will mean for furthering that mission, whether that's increased students or increased research, increased retention. If you can tie it to those kinds of things, we have a much better luck with our provost, with our CFO, with our president chancellor. And it's not just empty words. You really have to say, this is what if you invest in this building, here's how the metrics will move. Here's what the data will, here's how it will change. Here's the outcome that you can expect. So I think they all understand the problem. They're fiscally challenged, as we've talked about already. So we have to put it in those kind of, that kind of dimension. If you make this investment, it's not just taking care of deferred maintenance. Yes, it does that. But what do you get in return that's critical to the mission of the university?
I personally think deferred maintenance is just, it's like a unicorn. We talk about nobody actually knows what it is. I don't even believe the number for myself, even though I compute it every year because I have to give it to our board of regents. The reality is, I agree with you. It's outcome based, right? What is the maintenance critical to keep the university functioning in a way commensurate with how it sees itself? And if you can have that kind of contextualized conversation with leadership, traditionally we get the funding we need to do that. Maybe not all of it, but it's a lot closer to that. To fix $1 billion deferred maintenance number, your CFO is just going to look at you and go, "What? I'm never going to fix this problem. It's never going to change." But here's our mission critical needs that we need. We need about $10 million to fix X, Y, and Z, or here are the consequences of that intransigence on your part. And he usually says, "Okay, I can afford 5 now. I'll pay 5 later, and let's get to work," and we move on. But I do think that we've oversold the deferred maintenance number a little too much as facility people, and we need to start doing mission critical opportunities for the operations of the university as a better discussion point, because it's like the national debt, and nobody thinks about it anymore. It's just too big.
And to speak on the 2-year colleges, so we have 13 2-year colleges within UW system, and they were incorporated into the 4-year institutions, giving us authority, and they basically sign them out depending on the regions. UW-Platteville assumed the authority and operations of 2 branch campuses, but they both sit about an hour and a half away from Platteville in much, even more so, rural communities, farming communities. And these buildings that we've used for the colleges are in fact owned by the counties. And so we have to really create strong partnerships and relationships with the county officials to help move those branch campuses forward, because those buildings have also not been renovated in many, many years, and the counties just don't have the funds right now to invest in it. They're worried about other things. So it's one of the other issues of just, again, creating a strategic plan, talking about goals, and talking about how we can continue to even maintain enrollments, because in our branch campus, in reality, enrollments have been declining as well. So it's another issue of planning and tying it to strategy and involving the right people at the table.
Both, I think, tie into this next topic of sustainability. And how do you look at, that conversation of reduced utilization or increased utilization of space, maybe reduced footprint, helps with the carbon footprint. From a sustainability perspective, how has the conversation changed, or has it changed pre-COVID, post-COVID? Alex, start with you.
Okay. I think one of the things that we were, one of my favorite movies, Die Hard. You watch Die Hard and you watch the openings, the beginning of when they're taking over the Nakatomi Tower, and the guy's able to freeze the elevator for only 3 floors. And I think a lot of non-facility people traditionally think, well, that was in the 80s. Of course we can do that. No, we can't do that. We don't have systems that freeze our elevators for 3 floors. Most of our elevators from the 60s. And I think they thought that when the pandemic happened, we'd be able to cut utility costs with the push of a button. And 50% of our buildings still use pneumatic controls. And so we had people out there adjusting thermostats that still had mercury switches in them. And by the time we got all the buildings adjusted, then we decided to reopen campus. So we went back and we did it all over again. And so I think that we're able to have a little bit more recognition that what we think we do sustainable wise is not quite there yet. And if we really want to be ready to adjust and rapidly navigate changing environments, whether it be a pandemic, whether it be a focused change in pedagogy, whether it be a new opportunity for the university. We really need to invest in some better IoT. We need to invest in some better capability because our facility staffs are never going to be big enough to meet all those demands. I think a really negative consequence from a sustainability standpoint has been the trash side. Everything's disposable now. You know, we have a zero waste commitment at ASU, and we saw for the first time since we started this in 2007, our actual to the landfill this semester is going to go up because everything's take and go, grab and go, and it's styrofoam and it's non-recyclable. And though we've asked for compostable materials, they don't exist in the supply chain right now. So there's good and bad. There's a little bit more understanding of the challenge we have. Bad is there's no parts for any of this. There's no chips. There's no compostable materials. There's no ability to adjust yet, but it's coming.
Let me ask you a follow-up question, because we know on every campus or almost every campus, our students are very sustainably oriented.
Mm-hmm.
They're not coming demanding it; they're expecting it. If you don't do it, it's a negative. They may not come.
Yeah.
The kind of issues that you just talked about, though, are very different than that global save the planet kind of thing that students may march on. So I'm interested, not only with you, but maybe some of our colleagues in the audience. Are you able, or have you been able to, or how are you able to take that student assumption, that their commitment to sustainability, and channel that into some of the very specific things that as facilities folks we know could move that needle? Because that's the square that we're trying to circle. That's a little bit of a challenge, and we think if we can do that with students, perhaps we'd have better luck.
Yeah, I think we engage with the student governments, the coalition of student governments, and ask them what their priorities are, and we try to get resources for those, and they're willing to put student fees towards it. They're usually on the margins. They're not the big things. Bottle refilling stations, that's a huge priority for them. So I could get some of the deferred maintenance at the drinking fountain level funded through student fees. That way, it's a very small thing. The bigger things, carbon footprint wise, when you talk about it, they're willing to campaign for it, but I have to electrify campus. It's a $350 million project over 11 years because we use cogen for all of our heat load and all of our resiliency strategy. Students aren't really going to play a role in that, and so the big buckets not so much, but the little things, yeah, we can get some movement there. I haven't seen a way. If somebody's got a better idea, I'd love to hear it because our students are right. This is the first generation willing to totally sacrifice for sustainability. They're willing to make their quality of life worse if there's a sustainability component to it.
We've taken a similar approach working with our students. We surveyed them about 4 years ago, and 86% of the students who were at Platteville at the time said that sustainability and seeing institutions commit to that was one of the reasons that they would stay and or commit to an institution going forward. So we knew it was a top project. We had a very strong sustainability coordinator on our campus who happened to just go leave to work for the tech colleges, unfortunately, because of our pay wages compared to theirs. But the chancellor did something really interesting about 3 years ago. The students came and pitched, wanting sustainability efforts, wanting to create a solar array, wanting to see more solar panels on buildings, and wanting to go to zero waste. And he said, I absolutely support this. You find a way to fund it, and I will fully support it. And sure enough, to our pleasure, 2 years ago, they came back, and we now have a 2.4 megawatt solar array field on our campus because of the students' movement and because they came back with a way to have it built and funded by a private entity. The state supported it, and we will be paying that back in 15 years. So it was not something that we had to invest in right away. It was a way in which we could still accomplish the goals. So that is something that we're continuing to see. That was a significant project. And you're right, the other things they're in and out of, but that was one that we really were able to say the students were the reason that this was built.
Pivoting just slightly, one of the big challenges that y'all are facing, as we've talked and I've talked to many of you, is the workforce. There's been a wave of change, whether it's the silver retirement, whether it's just the overall retirement, people leaving to go to the private sector. In the 15 years I've been in the higher ed market, I've heard we have an aging workforce. And when I kind of look out across the stage here, I think we're getting a little bit better, but I think there's still an aging workforce out there. And that's a concern for many folks. And look at the number of positions opening at the senior facility officer place. When it comes to the workforce, and Paige, I'll ask you just kind of start with this. What's happening on your campus, and do you have a shortage of workers on campus? And how are we planning to fill that bucket?
Sure. Well, first I want to give a shout out to Kim's presentation yesterday. I learned so much, including about myself. So a lot of things suddenly rang true, especially some of the skepticism that I think I have at times. But what our issue on our campus is that with declining enrollments, we are making budget reductions each and every year to try to match our balances because we just don't have the same state support that we used to, and our tuition revenues are continuing to decline. So we don't have competitive wages with our workforce, and when we flipped and went to COVID and many employees went remote, we're seeing the employees return. The employees who are Generation X and Z is what I would say now. The millennials are the ones who are seeking additional opportunities to be flexible, as well as looking to have a much more balanced work life. And for example, I just promoted an assistant director in the budget office, and they're making a good wage, and they're now salaried. And they told me after I made the decision that they really don't plan on working more than 40 hours a week, and they have a family, so weekends and evenings are off as well. So I said, thank you, I appreciate that. So I will start now hiring for a permanent position in the next few months. But we, in our rural area of Wisconsin, we are seeing private industry pay a lot more currently. The way in which people are attracting strong and qualified applicants is different, and we are not ahead of that game, and we've got to get there. So with budget declines, we don't have a whole lot of money to put toward increasing wages, but we pay a minimum wage of right now about $12 an hour, and that includes many of our facility staff, and we're trying to increase that to $13.50 and get up to $15 in the next 2 years. So that's part of our plan to try to not only create and retain good talent, but again, continue to be competitive. Where we're really challenged is in our diversity efforts, because in southern Wisconsin, it's a very white rural community, and so we have issues with also retaining top talent in a diverse workforce because we just don't see the community support there.
What are the types of folks that you're going after these days?
Yeah, I might tag team on Paige's comment a little bit. And again, if you've got great solutions, we would love to hear them. We're not bashful, we'll steal any of them. And certainly we're doing some of the standard things. Kim talked last night about mentoring and apprenticeships, and we're looking to explore those and expand those. But one of the things that we're also doing is taking a look at what's the definition that we want for a facilities officer or facilities worker. And traditionally, that's been pretty straightforward, right? If you're looking for an HVAC tech, are you certified with certain things? If you're looking for a journeyman electrician, can you do certain skills? That's easy to quantify. And most of our PDs have always been written around that. And that's what we've traditionally looked for. And certainly we would love to have that, but I think we're having a hard time finding those kind of skills. And I think we, much like most of you probably, we're having a hard time competing in a wage with those kind of skills. So one of the things we're looking at is both because of that challenge and also because of the need to diversify, because our students are diverse and they're expecting that, we're looking at a different description, if you will, or maybe an expanded description of what we're looking for in a facilities person. And by that I mean we're looking to rewrite our position descriptions about soft skills. Or as one of my directors said, I don't think they should be called soft skills, they should be hard to learn skills. And increasingly, if you think about what we do as facilities groups, yes, we still have those work orders where individual employee goes out to do them, but increasingly we're talking about working in teams. We're talking about how do you interact with other employees, how do you collaborate with other employees. And with our expanded seat at the table, that more complex table, those kind of soft skills are more and more what we need. So if you expand that definition, then all of a sudden you might be able to look at some folks who you would have not even looked at before because they don't have the certifications, they don't have those things that you typically look for, but you can expand that definition. And so that allows you to bring in some more diverse workforce that you wouldn't have considered before. It certainly means you have to have a more robust training operation. You have to mentor them, you have to give them those technical skills. But I would argue that those technical skills are things, if they have the aptitude and the desire, you can teach those. It's the soft skills that are harder to teach and that increasingly we need. And so if we expand that definition, change our PDs, we think we can expand the potential pool of employees, which will help with our diversity, but also help in terms of bringing more folks into our team.
Yeah, it's not a pay issue anymore. We're out of the league. That conversation war has been fought and lost. Right now, Phoenix is probably over the next 5 years got somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $500 billion worth of new construction happening. The healthcare systems are offering electricians, if they stay for the entire week, $500 on top of their salary at the end of the week. I can't compete with that. I'm never going to become close to that. So I think one of the things we have to talk about from a long-term perspective is how we're going to get people back into trades and as a nation. And the one thing we do better than anybody is educate. And so how are we as higher ed going to play a role in people getting trained to become into the trades, which is kind of an announcement of what we do, right? We don't want them to come to college, we want them to go to the trades, but we need them to come to college to pay our bills. So we have a real challenge on our hands, and the discussion point is a career for life. You come into the trade, we'll help you, and then we'll start helping build those hard-to-learn skills with our classroom environments in a way that's meaningful to you, so you can build an entire career around what you can get as a lifelong learner at Arizona State University. And we need industry to participate in this because they're struggling too. And so we're seeing general contractors create training programs. They're not good at that. They're good at building stuff. We're good at training programs. Let's work together on this and try to solve this because otherwise we're in real trouble. And by the way, your tradesmen, they're moving to Phoenix. I mean, it's going to be ridiculous right now. We're the fifth largest and number 4 is in our sites. And we've got 6 fabs for microprocessors going up in the next 5 years. TSMC is going to spend $100 billion in construction in the middle of the desert. So that's a challenge that we've got to acknowledge.
Just to make one more comment as well, one of the other things that we're doing similar to what you had mentioned is we are looking at cross-training and creating more efficiencies within the current workforce that we have. So knowing we're doing more with less, we have less funding to support hiring and wages. We're starting to cross-train some of our custodial staff with the dining staff so that when there are lulls or times during the year that they're not as busy, they can actually start to assist others so that we can utilize the talent we have in order to, again, allow them to also have opportunities to possibly expand their experience, create more opportunities within the institution, and again, create savings and address the work needs that are there.
We've got a few more minutes left, and before I open it up to questions or comments from all you sitting out there, I wanted to ask our panelists kind of one final question. In the next 5 years for your specific organization, where do you find, or where do you anticipate the biggest challenge being?
Well, they're kind of all interrelated, right? We've touched on it, certainly budget, workforce. I think, though I'd phrase it a little bit differently, I think the biggest challenge is, we've talked a number of times here about we now have a seat at the table, a much more robust seat than we anticipated. I think the challenge, or maybe the opportunity, is how do we continue to earn that? How do we show that as facilities teams we can continue to respond, not just changing filters and cleaning floors, but responding the way we did with COVID. And so I think that's where we're going to see the biggest change in our profession is, for those who are successful, embracing that role in a more robust way than we did post-COVID or pre-COVID.
Dave has a history of making me better, so I'll pose the question differently to the two of you. What are you most excited about for the next 5 years?
Well, I was going to say the biggest challenge is burnout. I think that the reality is this became an operational issue from the outset, and nobody's better at operations than us. And so we became the go-to for every problem. And trying to make sure that we bifurcate that to getting back to what we do best and not being everything to everyone all the time is going to be hard to do moving forward. That being said, we have doors that open to us now that were never opened before. And that those doors we can walk through, but we got to walk through very carefully. Zoom has created a zero marginal cost to have a meeting now. There is no impact to the individual calling the meeting. Doesn't have to go anywhere. She doesn't have to set up any room. She just click a button. And so therefore we have Zoom meetings back to back all day long because nobody sees a consequence here. We've got to figure out how in this new environment to change the way we see things and how we prioritize. And quite frankly, we've never been allowed to say no before. We better be allowed to say no very quickly or we're going to be in trouble.
And I'm a problem solver. I want to figure out how to address, staying with high quality services out of our division, knowing that we have less funding and reduced staff and workforce. But I'm excited to create more efficiencies. I'm really focusing on creating more processes within our institution so that we are less siloed. We're centralizing more as far as the decision making. So at our campus, any person can request to have their office remodeled or have a project done or have furniture moved. We have just responded individually. We haven't really organized or assisted in helping the facility staff, in fact, have a thorough process that allows them to utilize their time and resources well. And so that's one of the areas that we're going to look at closely in order to, again, deal with burnout, ensure that we're providing quality services, but also ensuring that the priorities of the institution are being made in all the decisions related with the academic side as well.
Well, I thank you guys for the time here, but you're not done yet. I want to open it up to any questions out there, any comments that you had, anything that we talked about, or something that we haven't covered here down at the stage.
I do have one over here, James, and one outside of your periphery.
I can't see your thing over there.
Good morning, Leonard Hernandez. You mentioned about your custodians and having your custodians do other things outside their job description. Is that correct? How do you deal with the labor union? Because the labor union has been very difficult during this time as well.
In Wisconsin, we do not have strong labor unions. We have some trades, but by state statute, any type of union-related activity has really been minimized over the years. So it has not been an issue. I think more the issue for us is ensuring that that it's a voluntary process and that we're not creating additional duties for someone and then not ensuring that we're also not matching their pay and their expertise to that.
I think that's across the board. We're Arizona. We think we're red as the red gets, and so we've quashed all unions. But we do have problems across the board where people with this 24% vacancy rate are doing things out of job. And we've had to have talks with the supervisors and managers about that. But you've got to be very careful with that. We shouldn't be having general maintenance mechanics do medium voltage electrical work. That's a dangerous situation. It happens. They're trying to do that right now because we're not allowed to say no. And that's the conversation we're having at Exec this week. We've got to be allowed to say no at some point until we solve this problem.
I can't see.
There's a guy in the middle.
All right, give me a minute to make my way over here. Thank you, guys.
Good morning, and thank you for sharing your insight this morning. During your conversations about demolition and master planning, I was just curious, there's a lot of data out there that indicates there will be a reduction in the number of high school graduates beginning in 2025 and basically running through 2050. And I was wondering if that came up during your discussions, if it impacted your ideas in terms of your footprint, your campus footprint, and so on.
Well, I think those stats really depend on the region and the state. So in Florida, we're not seeing that. It doesn't mean we won't at some point. And we're certainly not seeing that in our institution. Our institution continues to set enrollment records every year. I do think we need to look at that carefully. And certainly other parts of the country, that is an immediate issue. I think probably in your area that is. You've mentioned that several times. So we've looked at it more in sort of how do we make sure we're recruiting and retaining those folks. But we're in a little bit different situation perhaps than
others in the nation.
I can't speak to that. We're the fastest growing city in the country right now. So and if we can't get them locally, we're going to take yours. That's my message to you.
Anecdotally, what I've seen in the marketplace is the larger institutions are continuing to grow in numbers. And I personally, from having folks that I've got kids in high school that are sending their kids to universities, the kids on social media are seeing, particularly in the Southeast, as they've mentioned, that there's a little bit more openness and to get that traditional collegiate experience outside the classroom, if you know what I mean. And so I see them gravitating a little bit more towards the larger institutions. And the mid-size, I think, are staying mid-size, and the small ones are starting to struggle just a tad. Another question?
Yes, but we don't have time. So that is our time for this session. Thank you, guys. Thank you, James, for your excellent moderating skills. We very much appreciate it. Thank you, and we'll see you again soon.